WashingTECH.
Let's take a look at the Center for Democracy and Technology, CDT, which published their annual report last week. Let's see what Google donated to CDT.
Welcome to the Tech Policy Leaders Podcast.
The world's most influential voices keeping you safe and informed online.
Streaming from Washington, D.C., America's tech law and policy epicenter. These are your leaders. This is the podcast.
Tech Policy Leaders with Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
WashingTECH, safe and informed since 2014.
Hey everybody, I decided to do a solo episode this week because I think it's really sort of super important to highlight bias in the public policy profession, because it is a profession. Because over the last 17 years that I've been working on tech and media public policy making, majority white organizations have always seemed to think it's sort of totally fine to attack organizations founded and led by people of color, orgs like this one, especially smaller orgs, attacking these organizations to pursue whatever status, ambitions, or whatever they have. So let's be transparent, shall we? Just to give you some background, when I started working in this space, there was one organization in Washington. It's called the Multicultural Media Telecom Council, that focused specifically on telecommunications and media policy making as they relate to underserved and underrepresented communities. This is where I cut my teeth as a young lawyer, in the only fellowship in town for somebody who, like me, who went to law school at night. But in any case, MMTC's members are, and continue to be, some of the finest minds in the business. Folks like Ari Fitzgerald, who's a partner at Hogan Lovells, who was on the show last week. So these are lawyers of color primarily, who are at the top of their craft. And let me interject something here real quick. This is in Oakland. We're not color of change. This is DC. It's a political town. It's buttoned up. And comparing orgs of color in this town to orgs like Color of Change is really just not a relevant comparison. A better comparison would be to an organization like NAACP or National Urban League, both of which have local chapters, but they're based in DC. So donations come from two primary categories here in DC: corporations and foundations. That's it. If you've been around a long time, like NAACP, NUL, or AARP, you have members. You can raise money from them in addition to seeking other forms of support. But for the most part, it's corporations and foundations. That's it. That's the way this market works. So back around 2011, 2012, it was organizations like Public Knowledge and Free Press calling out MMTC for accepting donations from Comcast. Again, one of the worst companies in the world for customer service, but they are internet service providers, and those are the issues that MMTC works on. It didn't matter if larger, huge nonprofits worked with these same companies. All that mattered at the time was that Free Press and Public Knowledge needed somebody to pick on when they were advocating for net neutrality. MMTC opposed net neutrality, which didn't make sense to me, which is why I started this org when I was laid off from the Joint Center, where I co-led an institute along with Nicole Turner-Lee, which also focused on telecommunications and media policy at the intersection of communities of color. So-called progressives with super deep pockets didn't like orgs like MMTC because they were the only game in town. They had too much credibility when it came to people of color in this space, and they opposed net neutrality for reasons, by the way, I continue to be baffled by, but in any case, they opposed it. So orgs like Public Knowledge and Free Press called them out. And I called out Public Knowledge and Free Press for having zero people of color working there, but somehow having the audacity to try and drag MMTC. And as a result of my advocacy, at least I think it was, since no one else was doing anything, Public Knowledge is led by the great Chris Lewis, who is African American, and Free Press by Jessica Gonzalez, who serves as co-president along with Craig Aaron. So these orgs now actively recruit. They got the lesson, they recruit diverse talent. They've changed drastically, and I'm proud of them. Jessica, Craig, and Chris are my colleagues, just like you are. It's like you have colleagues. They fixed their model and stopped attacking MMTC. We'll see what happens when and if the net neutrality debate starts up again. but for now we're good. Joe Torres is at Free Press too, and he wrote the book on diversity in the news profession. And he was there before, by the way. He was like the only person of color working there on policy at the time. So let's forward to 2016, when this organization, WashingTECH, was still an LLC. It was a for-profit. So someone I've known for a very long time, my dear friend Chanel Hardy, who I met when I first moved here. And, she worked at the National Urban League. She worked on the Hill and at the FCC. So, of course, she joined Google, just like white people join Google when they have these kinds of credentials, right? And again, as a result of my advocacy, since I was vocal about it, as I am now, one of our taglines then and now is the inclusive voice of tech policy, since nobody else cared about it until George Floyd and everyone started jumping on the bandwagon. In 2016, Google started a cohort of folks called Next Gen Policy Leaders, the only program in town at the time to engage and involve people of color in tech policy. I continue to participate in the program because it's educational, it offers great networking, and again, continues to fill a need that everyone else just woke up to a couple years ago. The lack of diversity on panels, at networking events, on faculties, you name it, related to tech policy issues. Google was the first mover, while the rest of these tech companies and nonprofits were asleep at the wheel. They didn't care. What do they care? So whose fault is that? Whose fault is it that Google built loyalty by investing in us? And I'm opening that up for conversation. Have a conversation about it. Whose fault is that? Now let's fast forward to today. Here comes another organization, the so-called Tech Transparency Project, which again isn't a racially and ethnically diverse organization, attacking Google Next Gen. Individuals who are part of the organization, like there's McCarthy's blacklist. In this mediocre paper suggesting that Google had bought out people of color so they wouldn't speak out about Timnit Gebru's firing. Again, Dr. Gebru's an engineer whom Google fired for speaking up about bias in one of Google's algorithms, or in their main algorithm. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. Something. She found bias. She was vocal about it, as she should have been, and she was fired. It's completely wrong. So, first of all, I opposed her firing, and vocally, on a listserv read by many Next Gens and other people of color in this space. I blasted Google for it. I was livid. I was so vocal, no one else in the Next Gen cohort needed to be, which is always the case in this town. And let me tell you something. We get pennies compared to some of these other larger organizations. Pennies. You know what Google donated to us last year? You really want to know? $35,000. The rest of our funding came from foundation support. But let's take a look at the Center for Democracy and Technology, CDT, which published their annual report last week. Let's see what Google donated to CDT. And CDT is a partner of ours. I'm on their advisory council. I don't see anything wrong with engaging with corporations that have corporate responsibility plans and seek to work with groups that are going to further that. But what let me tell you something. Like I said, CDT is a partner. Many of their fine scholars have been on the show. But let's take a look. You know what Google donated to CDT in 2021? Over $500,000. 2 other donors gave that much. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Knight Foundation. Now, let's go to CDT's search feature on their website to see how much work they've done on Timnit Gebru. How many times did CDT so much as mention Dr. Gebru's name, much less call out Google for firing her? 0. How many times did the Tech Transparency Project call out CDT in this paper or elsewhere for failing to discuss Timnit Gebru's firing? 0. So come on, let's talk about tech transparency, everybody. Come on, let's do it. I guarantee I've made more sacrifices in the cause of inclusion and so-called transparency in this space than most of Washington. Let's talk about it.
WashingTECH.